Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to the second day of the NGI for the IPv6 track. Hope you enjoyed the German night yesterday. What about you, Eric? Have you joined us afterwards? Sorry?
You know that I didn't.
Yeah, well, but we have been here until 9, so maybe you could have made it here, but yeah. So, basically, we have the whole day packed with awesome IPv6. Enno will be kicking off with some IPv6 address management, the first 5 years, where he's presenting, then followed by Eric, Gabriel, Johannes, and then last but not least, Fernando. And as usual, we have the tradition for the IPv6 track that we have a shared dinner, which will be taking place tonight in the restaurant Zum Güldenen Schaf, which is in the main street or in the Hauptstraße in Heidelberg. Basically, from here, it's a 30-minute walk, but buses will leave from the PMA at around 6:30. So please be our guest, and hopefully you will join us for the dinner. Yeah, that's all from my side, and without further ado, please welcome Enno, and then I will be handing over to you.
Oh, sorry for this. Does this mean that the sound is not recorded? Okay, but I mean, it is what it is, but just for interest. Another approach which has been kind of common for, say, mid-sized organizations in the IPv4 age was like apply for so-called provider-independent address space, PI addresses through, say, supported by a so-called sponsoring layer. Then you can get addresses from your provider, from the chunk that the provider has, bound to the contract, PA assignment, or you could do something else, go through a tunnel broker, which seems still a thing in the US. I don't think this is a good way to go, especially for mid-sized or larger organizations, but I note, say, once you look at the ARIN mailing list, there are still people apparently doing this or recommending this. Pretty much all organizations that I have in mind during this talk, which constitute, again, say, the sample that I can look at, which is from our customer space, have opted for the first approach, become an LIR and receive a block of IPv6 addresses thereby, which usually is /29. And I will use, say, during this talk, I will rely on this assumption: organization has received a /29 for their own use. There's good reasons to do this. I once wrote in a customer context a paper about this. I've anonymized this paper. I removed the customer-specific notions in it, and it's published. So if you're interested, what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing this, you can look at this document. When an enterprise follows this path, become an LIR, and thereby get like a /29, there's two things to keep in mind. Or like historically, one should have kept an eye on, that is the strict filtering thing. There are, or there have been, certain providers which actually filter routing announcements of a certain size. Once an organization does not, say, announce routing-wise the full address range, the so-called covering aggregate, but smaller pieces of this, it might happen, or it might have happened, that these routing announcements get filtered. This is called the strict filtering. I gave a talk on this at Troopers, I think Troopers 15, where we did a research project together with some guys from Burda, looking at the distribution of routes within at certain internet exchange points throughout Europe, and the evolution of the routing sizes and how many of those get filters or not. I would say in the last years I haven't seen issues in the space, and as I already mentioned, 46% of the global routing table in IPv6 are /48 right now, and this is say a small announcement as opposed to like announcing the full address space, which is 29 or /32. Then there is the thing of so-called out-of-region announcements. What happens once you get address space, say from RIPE, and use this address space in other parts of the world? I mean, internet routing is global, so you could expect that it gets routed, but there is always providers involved. There's local providers maybe involved. And how do you know if, say, a local provider in Argentina is actually going to accept a /48 route from European space, from another part of the world, say in a routing exchange happening somewhere in Argentina. This is called out-of-region announcements. In theory, this shouldn't be a problem. In practice, nobody really knew. What I can say as of today, we have several customers who actually do this, and we haven't observed any problems right now. So what we usually recommend as of today, this might change again, and this is in contrast to what we were recommending, say, like 5 years ago, is it should be sufficient to get address space from one region internet registry, say in Europe from RIPE, and use this for the whole organization, even say for local internet breakouts in other parts of the world. I'm aware that there are organizations who have explicitly chosen another path. Markus Keen from Microsoft told me that initially they were announcing only address space from ARIN, but they have opted to, as far as I understood, I will have to double check, but I'm pretty sure. Eric, do you remember what Microsoft does in the interim? I think I'm pretty sure they for geolocation reasons, they go with a multiple approach in the interim. Whereas, for example, Cisco, you still have one, only the ARIN space, right? So there is different approaches. Long story short, I don't expect, or we don't right now see any problems when it comes to out-of-region announcements, even of /48 prefixes somewhere in the world. So that was a bit of like how things might have evolved over the last years. Now let's have a look. Once you have received, say an organization has received an allocation, how can this be like distributed within an organization? The thing here is to keep in mind, and this is something we learned during those years. Say the handling of addresses. Let's state there's a process, and let's call this process address management. Such a process can serve different objectives, which I'm going to discuss on the next slide. And this process can happen, say, from a very high level perspective in two flavors. One is, let's call the one flavor prescriptive. So you try to regulate and try to steer and control the world by the way how you assign addresses. Like, here's the plan. And now we expect the world within an organization to follow the plan. And this is how we get things in proper order and into a structure and stuff. You might already note there is a bit of skepticism in my voice. This would require governance. This would require people within your organization, within your global organization, follow that nice and well laid out plan that you have come up with in your ivory tower. We will see this. This is not what we see happening. The other approach, like to the world, to the complex world of a global organization, could be what we could call a descriptive approach. Do not try to control reality, but try to perform an inventory. Try to observe what is happening, which addresses are used on which type of systems and in which networks. So this is more an observing and collecting role as opposed to a governing and steering role. Keep this in mind for a second. I have discussed this in greater length in a blog post I once wrote. When it comes to objectives of an address plan, like here is a block of addresses, and now let's think about how to use these addresses within an organization. This is often called design an address plan. And one thing to keep in mind here is, from our perspective, from our experience, Chris and I, we have probably been involved in like 20 to 25 address plan exercises of some way. Do an address plan, review one, be a sparring partner during a discussion. So we have seen a number of address plans in the last years. And one thing that we nowadays usually try to make people aware of is, like, once you come up with a plan, an address plan in this case, one should keep in mind such a plan can serve different functions, different objectives, different types of users. Is this plan well suited like for operational entities within an organization, or does it serve like more in a governance space? And what we usually do nowadays is to break it down to like 7 main objectives, which I'm going to discuss very briefly. The first one is persistence. To what degree is a plan suited to avoid renumbering, in short? So addresses, once assigned, don't have to be changed in the future at some point, like in 3 or 5 or 10 years. Then the second one is applicability. Applicability means to what extent does an address plan serve, say, the function that it facilitates handling of addresses by machines. So in firewall rules for quality of service. So how well, say, usually one can rate this, and this is what we usually do. Once there's a plan, we try to rate, okay, this plan serves persistence to like number 3 on a scale 1 to 5. This plan is suited to support the goal applicability, again, scale 1 to 5, and so on. And applicability, again, means to what degree can machines use, say, the structure of addresses during their work, like, again, in firewall rules. Then there is scalability. Is this scalable? This is somewhat related to persistence. Does the plan support what we call routing-based security, which could include stuff like do black hole certain prefixes at the border of your networks for security reasons? If one pursues such a strategy, this has to be supported by the plan. Ability to aggregate. Can we aggregate addresses to reduce the number of routes or the number of recalculation processes during routing convergence? This is, let me state this, for most enterprises we know. And again, we know some very large enterprises with like, say, 10K routes in their organization internal MPLS networks. But once it's about these numbers, like several thousands of routes, which even is a large number for enterprise organizations, ability to aggregate is overestimated. This is not, this might be a goal for providers running large POPs in a country, but routing aggregation nowadays with today's hardware shouldn't be your concern. There is ability to delegate. How well does it serve? How well does an address plan serve the objective? Like, can we take a chunk and hand it over to a project, or to the new data center provider, or to the guys running the smart cloud, whatever digitalization project? Can we just take a piece and hand it over to somebody else? This becomes more and more important, I think. And then there is, people have discussing this for years, like, how well can you, from a human, looking at an address, derive conclusions like, oh, looking at the address, this must be the site Hamburg as opposed to the site Munich, or this is the building 5, or this is a printer as opposed to a phone, stuff like this. This is completely overestimated. Don't look at this goal. The organization will probably move faster than there will be any benefit from this. Machine-based processing of addresses is one thing, that's applicability, but human-based processes like the processing of addresses don't take care of this. This is one thing, again, that we have learned. So back to one observation I already mentioned. There has been, like 5 years ago, and we have been involved in such exercises as well. There was the approach of, wow, IPv6, and now we can do everything better than we have done with IPv4. With IPv4 there was chaos. With IPv6 we can have a nice, proper laid out network with proper addresses. And people came up with plans. Like there was say at Cisco Live, is there still this address planning that Veronica initially gave? But I mean, it's somewhat provider-centric. But the thing is, there was this idea. One can come up with nice plans based on sites and services, and we have voice versus data, and within data assign /56 prefix or chunks to like servers as opposed to say clients or peripherals, and wireless versus wired, all this stuff. I can tell you, and we have been involved in such exercises. We even did plans based on these assumptions and objectives. And in hindsight, I mean, hindsight is 20/20, but in hindsight, it was wasted money. All these plans which we and others have designed like 5 or 7 or even 3 years ago, none of, at least in the space that we can look at, none of those has really been implemented in a reasonable way. Why is that? The thing is, organizations are complex, they move fast. There is this acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguity, which applies to many complex organizations. So there is movement, things change, things move like IT-wise, move to the cloud, there is IoT, there's all types of stuff happening. There is, as of today, in many organizations, one can see a certain say, approach to do projects, like Agile, or MVP-driven, most viable products. So projects, network projects, with a time scale of like 6 months. Within 6 months, we should have like a result, which in practice means people try to drive things. They buy hardware which is not suited to the task, as it turns out later on. They assign some addresses to stay within these 6 months. Stuff like this. Nobody follows the plan anyway. Actually, what we observe is these well laid out and well meant plans. It just doesn't happen in practice, which is why we nowadays recommend a bit different approach when it comes to address planning. One approach that has in mind to, say, pursue goals of flexibility and being a bit liberal. I had a kind of, I wouldn't say epiphany, but a revelation moment 2 years ago. We were, Chris and I were tasked in a large organization. Actually, I think they are running one of Germany's largest enterprise, or say private networks. They have their own MPLS network spread throughout Germany. And they had come up with an IPv6. It's a large organization, several hundred K of employees. Complex, lots of politics, lots of kingdoms within the organization, not too much governance, say from a global perspective. And the thing is, they brought us in, like, can you guys please review our address plans? We have 2 camps, and can we please have a third-party opinion? And then there were 2 groups, 2 project teams, which actually presented their address plans to us. And the first one was textbook-like. Like, oh, we have /48 for the sites, and then 56 for the different types of systems. And it was like if you had read, say, Tom Coffin's book, which is a good book. It's just it might apply to a specific type of organization, or you had looked at the RIPE. There's the RIPE document, how to come up with an address plan, which is from 2011 or 2012. Which probably was a proper thing at the time. It's just times might have changed. Anyhow, so that one was textbook, greenfield, like it would have been taught in any like IPv6 address planning university curriculum at the time. And then there were the other guys. There was another which had an approach like, well, you know, we consider the different organizational entities within the large tanker of that organization as kind of customers, and we just hand out, they all have their own VPN, their own VRF in our company-wide MPLS network, and we just hand out, say a /44 to each of them, and what they do with this, it's up to them. And I was scratching my head. But you can't really do this. This is ridiculous. There's no plan in it. There is no governance in it. There is no structure in it. say humans have, especially to work with stereotypes here, especially we Germans, we have a reputation of being, have an approach to the world with order and structure and all this. And I was scratching my head, oh, you guys, you can't really do this. And the more I thought about this, and this organization has been a customer of us for like 10 years, so we know a bit about them. The more I thought about this, I was like, well, that's probably the way to do it, as the other way would require governance, would require like people following a plan which was laid out in corporate headquarters, and then say have worldwide all entities, however far or how far they might be away following this plan. And the governance is just not there to do this. And in the end of the day, especially keeping the specifics of that organization in mind, we recommended going with the second approach. And since then, we have designed plans in other organizations which roughly follow the scheme that those guys had laid out. And this scheme is quite simple. This scheme can be broken down to, say, assume an organization has received a /29 from RIPE. Take 1/32 to stay on nibble boundaries. I'm not going to discuss why, just let me state it makes sense from several angles, and namely when it comes to reverse DNS, which is usually on the nibble boundaries, and reverse DNS makes a lot of sense in IPv6. It makes a lot of sense for IPv4 as well, but especially in V6, we strongly recommend to have a proper DNS, both forward and reverse. So take 1/32. And then there is 3 hierarchy levels, or maybe even just 2. The first one, let's call it for the purposes of this talk like a segment ID. This segment ID is just a generic high-level identifier for something, where something can be like a site. Site Berlin gets a /44. Whatever they do with this, assign a /44. It might be assigned to a subsidiary. In many organizations, subsidiaries have a certain autonomy. So it might be difficult from like Ivory Tower headquarters to prescribe to them what they do in, say, Ireland or Romania or Argentina, wherever. Anyway, but with this, like, hand over a chunk and that's it. The thing about the segment ID, it's given its it's designed kind of with flexibility in mind. You can assign it like to one of these projects, digitalization, something smart, whatever. Oh, we have these. We have just bought a startup, and they are going to design a new version of our one of our main services. And these are hipsters, like in Berlin. They don't follow rules anyway. So just here is a chunk of addresses. Whatever you do with it is. That's the mindset behind the segment ID. Given its say coming from a /32 perspective, we think it's reasonable, and this is what we see. Actually, that's what I'm going to discuss here. This is the talk, as I already mentioned, is based on case studies in reality. So this is already done in organizations, and so it's the three first letters of the third quartet of an address, and this segment ID is handed out like sequentially. There is no like country flag in it, or no like business unit encoded, nothing like that. Just here is a chunk of addresses. We have observed that it makes sense like to group them in a certain way, which means if you look closely at this, you might note there is There is only zeros here or 8s, which means usually these segments IDs, or again, in 2 organizations where we see this approach being used in the interim, there are groups of 8. The first one is handed out, and if it turns out, say that a project needs a larger space, or say there is subsidiaries within Europe are grouped in a specific way or something, say there can be consecutive groups of or consecutive segment IDs. So there's groups of 8, and the first one is handed out, and the other 7 are kept in reserve. That's the main thinking here. To already point you to the third part of the talk, once you do this or follow such an approach, obviously, or maybe obviously, it's crucial to have like a, say, a proper process, how to hand out, who does this in practice. I will get back to this. Actually, in the corporate reality where we work, it turns out this might be coming up with a plan, with an Excel, which has been discussed in some iterations in working groups. This is kind of easy, kind of. Depends on the organization, but this can be done with reasonable effort. And even, say, presenting such a concept in the plan to some architecture committee and getting approval, again, this can be done with reasonable effort. But what happens once IPv6 is really going to deploy it in the wild? Which process takes place then? We will see this might be very important, or actually it is very important. It will be covered, just to make you aware that the segment ID thing has to be supported in a proper way. Then there is what we call the sub-ID. The sub-ID is, first, this is optional. One doesn't have to use this. There is a certain ID behind, which I'm going to lay out right now. The sub-ID is the 4th letter of the 3rd quartet, and the sub-ID is meant like to give a label to a specific segment ID. This label can serve different functions. The most important one might be like, do not route this publicly. Say once a segment ID is can be used for loopback addresses of internal of devices. Or one might assign to, say, research facilities where the expectation is, well, probably these facilities should never talk to the outside world. Stuff where you can, with a reasonable high certainty, assume this is not use addresses for something which is not supposed to be reachable from external network or untrusted networks, where untrusted networks might be the internet, might be say business partners, whoever. Then one can use the 4th letter, say, as a label to actually control how this is handled routing-wise or on firewalls or stuff. The thing here is, once this is used, and we see this in networks, all involved parties have to understand the implications, especially when it comes to operations. Like, say, for example, one approach that we see is like use the letter F to make clear this is not excuse me. The expectation is not to be routed globally, or to be reachable from the global internet. So whatever has an F in it either gets null routed on border gateways, or gets filtered by firewalls, which then requires wildcard-based rules, which we see more and more devices actually support wildcard-based rules, which then is easy. Like once an F is here, just drop it. This again illustrates a bit the idea behind the sub-ID, but one has to be careful. This is only makes sense if actually, say, once you tell the people in the field, oh, when an F is here, when you assign an F to the 4th letter, you can expect that this is not reachable from the global internet, you actually have to enforce this on devices or, say, again, by null or black hole routing. If you don't do this, there is a gap of expectation and reality, which then requires communication, which then requires governance, all these things that might be lacking. So be careful about with the sub-ID, but this is the idea behind it. And then there is say, what we call a network ID, which can be anything. There is no like structuring as for groups of systems or operating systems or peripherals versus desktop devices or whatever. It's just within a segment ID, people can do whatever they want. This is to summarize an approach that we think actually works in practice and that we see being used. And as you might have noted, this is not what you might have learned about address planning, say, 5 years ago. Point just is all these, again, well laid out and structured plans. This doesn't work in practice, as requires governance, requires communication, requires all types of things that in volatile network environments might be lacking. This brings me to the third part of the talk, which is to discuss briefly aspects of, say, distribution processes of addresses. The background of this part of the talk is the following. As I mentioned, we have been involved in exercises on address planning in several organizations. In practice, this means that regularly in two very large, say, German stock index, the DAX 30 organizations, where I have done this stuff, I regularly nowadays get emails like, oh, dear Enno or dear Mr. Rey, I've heard that you have done the address planning for us. For a specific project, we need addresses. Can you please assign a block to us? And I'm like, oh, wait a second. I'm an external guy. I know that on this SharePoint, the XY, there is an Excel sheet, which was a result of a certain effort at the time. And this sheet has been maintained by different parties. So please do not ask me. But then the question is, okay, who to ask? And even if there is, say, a project group, IPv6, and I'm part of this, and there is people actually who have read-write access to this Excel sheet, or maybe even to the IPAM system where the addresses have been put into, which in quite some organizations is like Excel with a GUI, and does not really interact or interface with, say, with an IPAM. There's different approaches how to run an IPAM. I'm assuming that everybody's aware what an IPAM is, an IP address management system. These systems can work like in an active role, act as like DHCP or even DNS servers, so actually hand out parameters and properties to systems, to end nodes, or they can work like in a passive, or so let's say inventory role, which means observe the world and collect all types of information, which are actually handed out by other types of systems like DHCP servers are maintained on DNS servers. But getting back to this, there might even be IPAMs. But then, as IPv6 is really happening now, and it's happening like in projects and in a volatile way, the thing is, of writing emails to somebody, like, can you please hand out a block of addresses, and which is then maintained in an Excel sheet, which is then on like a corporate SharePoint somewhere. This might not be the best way to do it, but again, as I already mentioned, this talk is based on practical experience and practical environments, and as I stated, two of those DAX 30 title organizations. I am in that role, and I get those emails. So, which is why I came up with like, okay, guys, this is not how it's supposed to work. Please, let's have a working group and discuss how a proper process especially for IPv6. There is hopes that such process, once set up, can be applied to IPv4 as well. But say in retrospective, I don't think this is going to work. But we'll discuss this. Background again here. What is reality? And say we were in one organization. We set up a working group to discuss how such a process could look like, and I'm going to do actually the slides. The next 10 slides are coming from that working group, so it was kind of easy for me to recycle them. In another organization, I was tasked like, okay, now can you please describe like a green field, a proper process, and then we can discuss how to say map this process to our organizational entities and roles and responsibilities. The thing is, what we did when we assembled this working group to discuss how such a process would look like, we tried to take a step back and to think about, okay, what is, it's about IP addresses. What's the role of an IP address? An IP address constitutes say, an identity of a system, or at least, say, an interface of a system at a specific point of time. So it's an identity, and this identity can both use like for communication, and it can be used for, say, ex post identification, looking at log files, which entity was involved in a certain communication at a certain point. Given that I have a background in operations in the 90s, and then later on in the early 2000s, I did firewall, third level support in some organizations. So I have an operations background. My main, say, message to the people in that working group was like this one. There is, whenever you do IP networking, there is one thing to keep in mind. That is, okay, the lifespan might be limited, but the one thing to keep in mind, the memento mori of IP networking is renumbering, still needs work, that's the title of an RFC. That's a kind of euphemism. Renumbering hurts. Renumbering is a pain in the ass. So whatever you do with addresses, keep in mind, whatever your efforts might be, perform them in a way that avoids renumbering in the future. Now thinking, why, what reasons might there be why renumbering happens of IP addresses in organizations? One thing is addresses are not unique within an environment. Everybody who's been involved in like mergers and acquisitions, or in like corporate consolidation, or bringing, say, like this unified global network projects which have been happening in organizations in the last 10 years, will probably know what I talk about once you realize, oh, there is, say, all these subsidiaries which previously have been autonomous, and all of them have, turns out all of them have 10/something, 10.something/something IPv4 addresses. So addresses not being unique might be one reason to renumber. In IPv4, there was a clutch to solve this called NUT. With IPv6, there is no NUT, and actually one doesn't need NUT as long as homework is done in the proper way. The other thing is assigned addresses might be unfit for the purpose. This is a clear risk when it comes to the way how we see network projects being done today. There is a number of organizations we know where network projects are done in a more or less agile way, which means, well, we have to say, as I already mentioned, we have the 6-month span, and until then we have to deliver some project result, which means, well, okay, we can't undergo, say, complex address discussion things. Just let's assign something here. which we know is available. Looking at the Excel sheet, well, we can take this thing here, or discuss with another project team, stuff like this, and say 12 months later, it turns out, well, you guys, the addresses here, which you assign to these systems here, this doesn't really scale, or you can't use them as they might not be routable where they should be routable, and stuff like this. So again, this brings me to keep in mind renumbering must be avoided by all means, which might be even more interesting when it comes to IPv6 to keep in mind here. And these are one-to-one slides. I didn't change anything except for putting the Troopers logo on the master slide. This is from that working group we've been working on. People had the idea like, well, we can essentially do, why not use the same processes for like address administration within the organizations than we did with IPv4. First question could be like, oh, can you please describe these processes? That's this Excel sheet which exists in 5 versions and 5 different organizational entities, and which has to be aligned with the third-party provider doing the network services. But the thing is, there was one main thing about IPv6 to be kept in mind here. Once you use in your organization, and this applies to many organizations, RFC 1918 space for IPv4, that space doesn't have an owner. That space doesn't get routed in the internet, so you can essentially do with it whatever you want. With IPv6, global addresses, which, keeping the first part of the talk in mind, might have been received by acting as a local internet registry, those are global addresses. With great power comes great responsibility. You should make sure that there is abuse handling. There shouldn't be any route leaks. You might avoid, I discussed this I think 2 years ago when I discussed how to approaches how to connect business partners with IPv6. There might be scenarios where parts of your network inadvertently become a transit for, say, business partners or for something. All these have to be kept in mind. IPv6 are global addresses by nature. Say, there is ULAs and stuff, but let's not discuss this here. I don't think the use of ULAs makes much sense in the vast majority of organizations and cases. Handling v6 addresses, global ones, might be a bit different than handling RFC 1918 space in IPv4. When it comes to v6, as I already mentioned, these are public resources. These are resources which require membership. Membership requires payment, which might not be easy in organizations. There's like a yearly invoice from RIPE, and corporate purchasing might come up with, who's that RIPE? They are not registered in the supplier portal. Or they didn't send a quote. We can't process this for payment. We've seen all this. Again, there is some new tasks and duties arising from the fact that IPv6 global addresses are used. There is, when it comes to this RIPE membership, there are specific processes. Payment, maintenance of certain objects in the RIPE database, maybe attending RIPE meetings to know what's going on there, which is a good thing anyway. I recommend doing this. You can learn a lot from the peers at RIPE meetings. So, in short, there is a change of way how things are done with certain addresses, with IPv6 global addresses as opposed to IPv4, say RFC 1918 space. Then we try to come up, okay, how do we do it actually as of today? And as you can see in several organizations where we work, there is nothing for IPv6. There's no process. There is this plan, usually, as I mentioned several times, in an Excel sheet. And there might be like assignments in an IPIM system, but that's it. No process. So we try to come up with an idea how such a process could look like in that working group, and we initially, we grouped, we came up with a view, okay, what type of, say, of high-level processes are involved? There was all the thing related to the LIA, Local Internet Registry Administration. There might be an ownership and maintenance of the address concept, of the plan. There might be actually, people asking for addresses. So there must be a process. So once a party asking, let's call this party the requester. Requester asks for a chunk of addresses, how to get that to that entity. And actually, there is, let's say, the address repository, an inventory of which addresses are in actual use or are actually assigned to specific entities. And somebody has to take care of this inventory needs an owner. And so the main discussion was, okay, which entities within organizations, within an organization should take part of the, should perform these processes. And this is what, after several iterations and discussions, we came up with. This gives an idea of, how such a process could look like. There is a requester, there's some party, a project or a site administrator, or in many cases, as of today, a third party, a new data center provider, after 5 years, and there's discussions going on with them. In the contract, in the RFP, there has to provide IPv6 from the very first minute, and even enabled, not just capable and dormant, but has to be there. And then there is this transformation phase, and in this transformation phase, there's the discussion, okay, which addresses to use? And in an ideal case, to use organization internal ones, own ones. That's why one became LIA, right? And not use the ones of a data center provider. But then again, the parties involved have to be aware of that. So there is a requester. This requester asks for, I need a segment ID. I need such a chunk as /44 in some way, which is going to be discussed in a second. There is some entity which I call an address admin. This is a role. This role can either perform, say, a plausibility check, or perform a consulting role to the project. Then there has to be some approval. This can be supported by tools. I will discuss this in a second. There might be some interface to an IPM system, okay, this segment ID actually now is in active use, which might have been pre-populated within the IPM. And there might be an interface to the RIPE database in the very moment when a Route 6 object has to be created. So, say, a specific range can actually be routed in the internet without being filtered. This is how such a process could look like. And on the next slides, I have some, say, details of the discussions of properties of the project, the process. Do we need an authentication or authorization thing for the requester in the organization where we did this? The conclusion was of the working group, no, we don't need this. Anybody can perform such a request. We tried to discuss, is this going to happen via, say, a web interface, via an email, as is today, or via a ticket? The idea was to use a ticket. There should be some guidance here for the project actually requesting. This is what IPv6 serves for. You can get a certain address space. There was no additional rules, but you have to take care it's properly documented. In case you have any questions, ask the address admin. Stuff like this. As I already mentioned, the requesting party can be anything. Can be a project, can be a third party. Whoever needs addresses within the organization. I will skip this in the interest of time. I will publish the slides anyway, right after the talk, so you can, in case you missed something, or this stuff will be available. One thing we came up with is we try to implement this process in a way that it can be automated to the best possible degree, which means once a requester needs addresses, and those are not going to be publicly routable, which can be like an attribute within the ticket, we even came up with like, okay, then all this can happen in an automated manner. No human intervention needed at all. Human intervention only needed once this routable, say, flag is set. Then there is a question, how do you document which, say, addresses have already been assigned? Proper workflow with the IPAM, like is in use now, assigned to the following party and based on the following ticket number, stuff like this. I already mentioned this approval process can be automated, no human intervention at all, only once, say, must be routable. Then an additional pair of eyes look at this. And there is some preparations which can be done with the IPAM system, like pre-populate all potential segment IDs, group them by 8, and once, say, a ticket is approved, create the proper Route 6 object in the right database by automated means, which by most some years ago, we did an evaluation of commercial IPAM systems and their IPv6 capabilities. Those systems which were involved at the time, like the main players, Blue Cat Infoblox, and so on, pretty much all of them support such a workflow. One thing that we discussed in length is which type of fields should such a ticket have. This is how fields of a ticket, once it's not just free text fields, can look like. The thing here is, this part of the process is still in green field. We would like to implement this, but this requires to have tickets with these fields, which in theory is doable with all the systems, the ticket systems like ServiceNow, BMC, whatever. The thing is, somebody has to implement this, and one has to balance. Is it worth the effort? How many of such requests will happen per year? Is it worth the effort of like putting 10 man days into coming up with proper tickets and a proper workflow? Stuff like this. In the end of the day, the main thing is that we think, again, based on several months of discussion, that a proper process to, once you have such a scheme of addresses, to actually bring them to the field could look like this. And what we learned in several projects in the interim is this process is crucial. The nicest plan doesn't have any real benefit once you don't bring it to the, say, to the field, to the trenches. And as I mentioned in the very first part of the talk, it's happening now. We see, at least in the organizations where we work, a lot of movement towards IPv6. People realize, oh, we have these projects going on. This is the right time to bring in IPv6 now that we touched a lot of stuff anyway, or say a data center provider transformation is performed. We can't wait another 3 to 5 years. Let's do it now, and then you need the right supporting infrastructure. Which means, conclusions, IPv6 is different from IPv4, as I mentioned in pretty much all of my conclusion slides in the last years. It's not the same processes, not the same procedures. It requires, at least in some parts, different handling. When it comes to IPv6 address planning, title of my talk, don't be overly excited with coming up with detailed plans. Be liberal. Reality will have its own requirements anyway. Keep in mind, renumbering hearts and costs. Avoid renumber. Whatever you do with addresses, avoid try to come up with something which does not require renumbering in 3, 5, or even 10 years. And think about the processes involved. The earlier, the better. Thank you for listening.